The snow had fallen early that year, covering the small colonial village of New Haven in a thick white silence. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint smell of wood burning clung to the air. Winter was usually a time of peace, but this year, it was just another season of war. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the market square, wrapped in a coarse wool shawl. Her gloved fingers curled tightly around the handle of a wicker basket. At 19, she was barely taller than her younger cousins and thin enough that even 3 layers of skirts didn't hide the sharp outline of her knees. Townspeople passed her without a second glance. Just Clara, the weak girl with the quiet voice, the one who never went to the meetings, never spoke out, never raised a fist. But that didn't mean she wasn't listening. Her ears were sharp, always tuned to whispers and tension. Over the past year, New Haven had become a crossroads for Patriot messengers and supply wagons. Soldiers came through with limping horses and empty eyes. The war was never far away. It lived in their food shortages, in the wounded men carried in during the night, and in the sudden disappearances of neighbors who had once smiled at her across the church pews. And yet, Clara had never been allowed near it. "Stay in your lane," her older brother William would say. "You're too delicate, Clara. The war's no place for a girl like you." Even her father, once a doctor in the French and Indian War, had agreed. "Let the men bleed, Clara. You stay clean." She hadn't argued. She never did. But something in her was stirring now. Something had shifted. That morning, while delivering bread to the pastor's wife, Clara had overheard 2 British loyalists whispering in the alley behind the tailor's shop. She'd only caught fragments. "Ambush general moving him tonight." But it was enough. Enough to tighten her gut with dread. That night, after her chores were done and her family slept, Clara slipped out of the house with nothing but her cloak, a thick wool blanket, and a satchel with herbs she'd quietly learned to use from an old healer in the hills. The moon was a pale eye above the snow, and the forest road beyond the village was dark, the kind of dark that makes even the brave hesitate. Clara did not hesitate. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. Maybe she expected to find nothing. Maybe it was madness. But her heart pounded with something new, a fierce defiance that burned hotter than her fear. The trail was nearly invisible under the snow, but she knew it well. Her brother used it when sneaking out to join the local militia. It curved away from the village toward the hills and deeper woods, toward where the messengers passed, toward where someone important might be moved in secret. Hours passed. Her boots were soaked, her fingers numb, and her breath came out in ragged gasps. But just as she considered turning back, she heard it, a faint groan carried by the wind. Clara froze. Then it came again. A broken, aching sound, not the cry of an animal but of a man in pain. She followed the sound off the trail, pushing through thorns and brittle branches, until she saw him. A man lay sprawled beneath a fallen log, barely visible against the snow, dressed in a shredded blue coat stained dark with blood. His face was pale, nearly gray. His lips trembling as he whispered nonsense to the trees. His left leg was twisted at a sickening angle. One hand still gripped a pistol, though the barrel was buried in the snow and the flint broken. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. "Sir," she whispered. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open for a moment, startlingly blue, clear despite the fever. Then they rolled back as he groaned and passed out. She didn't know who he was yet. Not really. But she recognized the insignia on his shoulder, the golden star sewn into the torn blue wool. He was a general, Patriot general, and he was going to die if she didn't do something now. Clara's hands trembled as she pulled the blanket from her satchel and wrapped it tightly around his chest. She dug through her herbs, ignoring the snow numbing her fingers, and crushed 2 roots into a pulp before pressing them against the wound on his side. Blood seeped through the cloth, warm and terrifying. But she didn't stop. She cleaned it as best she could, whispered quiet words to herself to keep from panicking. Then she made a decision. She couldn't carry him. Not all the way back. But she could drag him. She found a broken sled under a hunter's shelter nearby. Half covered in ice but strong enough. She rolled the man onto it with all the strength her tiny body could summon, gritting her teeth as he moaned in pain. Then she pulled. One foot in front of the other, breath after breath, Clara dragged the wounded general through the snow. Hours passed. The sky grew pink with dawn. And still she pulled. By the time she reached the edge of the village, her arms were shaking, her knees buckling. But she didn't stop until the church steeple came into view. Only then did she collapse beside him, her hands raw and bleeding, her face streaked with tears and frost. The guards who found them minutes later would never forget the sight. A girl, barely more than a shadow, curled beside one of the most important men in the Continental Army, half frozen yet alive. And all she had was a blanket, a handful of herbs, and more courage than anyone in town had ever imagined. The sun broke slowly over New Haven, casting golden light across the snow-covered roofs. It should have been an ordinary morning, men heading to the blacksmith's, women hauling buckets from the well, but nothing felt normal. Word had spread like wildfire through the village. Clara Whitmore dragged a dying general through the woods by herself, in the middle of the night, with no weapons, no help, just a blanket and a satchel of herbs. For the first time in her life, Clara was the center of attention. She stood awkwardly just outside the church infirmary, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her shawl was damp, her fingers bandaged, and her boots stained with blood and mud. Inside, the general, still unconscious, was being tended to by the town's only doctor, who had muttered something about miraculous timing when he saw the state the man had been in. Clara didn't feel miraculous. She felt sore, exhausted, and embarrassed. People kept staring. She could hear them whispering. Little Clara Whitmore, the same one who fainted during last year's pig slaughter. She pulled a man twice her size 5 miles through the forest. Alone. I heard she fought off a bear with her bare hands. Clara flushed. The truth was less dramatic, and somehow more unbelievable. She hadn't fought anything. She just acted. Something inside her had clicked when she saw the general lying in the snow. There hadn't been a choice. Only the next step. And then the next. A familiar voice broke through the murmurs. Clara! She turned to see her brother William striding toward her, his coat flapping in the breeze, boots crunching through the snow. His face was red, not from the cold but from anger. You went into the woods alone, he hissed. At night. What were you thinking? Clara flinched. You could have been killed. If not by redcoats, then wolves. Or worse. And dragging a wounded man through snow. Are you insane? A few townspeople edged away, pretending not to eavesdrop but clearly listening. Clara swallowed hard. I overheard something. Men talking in the alley behind the tailors. They said something about an ambush. General. I didn't know if it was real, but you thought you'd go save him yourself? William snapped. You're not a soldier, Clara. You're not trained for this. No, she said, her voice low but firm. But I was there. And I could help. So I did. That silenced him. Not because he agreed but because he had no answer. A moment later, a tall man in a dark military coat stepped out of the church door. He looked weathered, with a scar down one cheek and eyes that had seen too many battles. He scanned the crowd, then stopped on Clara. You, he said, pointing. Come with me. Clara hesitated. Me. You're the girl who brought him in. I need a word. William started to object, but Clara stepped forward before he could stop her. She followed the soldier inside. The air in the infirmary was warm and smelled faintly of herbs and sweat. The general lay on a cot in the center, his chest rising and falling slowly beneath a heavy blanket. A bandage wrapped around his ribs. His leg had been splinted. He was still unconscious, but color had returned to his face. He'd be dead if it weren't for you, the soldier said. Do you know who this is? Clara shook her head. General Elias Thatcher, one of Washington's most trusted field commanders. He was being moved undercover toward Boston when the Loyalists struck. Ambush. We lost half the escort. Everyone thought he was dead. Clara stared at the man lying on the cot. She had expected him to be important, but that important? The soldier continued. You found him by chance? No. I heard men speaking in the alley. I followed the trail I knew the militia used. It wasn't chance. He studied her for a moment. And the herbs? Who taught you that? An old woman who lived in the hills. She treated sick children in the village when no one else could. Listened. Practiced on rabbits. The soldier nodded slowly. Well, you saved a general, Miss Whitmore. And you may have changed the course of this war. Her breath caught. I didn't do anything that. You did, he interrupted. And you're not finished. What do you mean? He looked her over. The general won't be able to travel for weeks. He'll need constant care. Medical. Quiet. Discretion. We can't move him to a military outpost. If the British find out he's alive, they'll finish what they started. That's why we're asking you to stay with him. Me. Clara blinked. But I'm not a nurse. I'm not trained. You got him this far. And frankly, we don't have anyone better. The less movement, the safer he'll be. And you know how to keep quiet. Clara looked at the general again. His eyes were still closed, his face peaceful. But under that peace was a man hunted. A man at the center of a war bigger than anyone in New Haven could imagine. And somehow she was now part of it. She drew a breath. I'll do it. The soldier nodded once. We'll station a man outside the church at all hours. Just in case. But inside, it's all you. The days that followed blurred together. Clara stayed by the general's side, tending his wounds, feeding him warm broth when he could swallow. She learned to change bandages with precision, to manage fever with herbs. She read to him softly from old books to calm his restless dreams. He didn't speak for nearly a week, but when he finally opened his eyes and looked at her with clear recognition, he whispered, Angel or rebel? Clara smiled faintly. Maybe both. Outside, the town still murmured. Some still called her foolish. Some still called her fragile. But others had begun to call her something different. Hero. The first time General Elias Thatcher sat upright on the cot, Clara dropped the bowl of broth she was holding. The ceramic shattered on the floor, sending a trail of steaming soup across the wood. She gasped and scrambled to clean it, but the general just chuckled softly. His first sound that wasn't a groan of pain or a fevered murmur. Don't worry, he rasped, his voice like gravel. I've seen worse spills. Clara looked up at him in disbelief. You're awake. Properly awake. Mostly. He squinted at the broken bowl. Though your cooking might have just finished me off. She laughed, a real full sound that surprised them both. It had been 12 days since she had dragged him through the snow. 12 days of wiping sweat from his brow, checking his pulse, changing bandages that leaked more blood than she liked to admit. 12 days where she hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time. But now he was awake, alert, alive. You saved me, he said, eyes locked on hers. I found you, she corrected gently. You carried me, he countered. That's not the same thing. Clara didn't know what to say. No one had ever looked at her like that before, with respect, with genuine gratitude. Not her brother, not the townspeople. Certainly not a general in George Washington's army. I was just doing what I could, she said, avoiding his gaze. Well, he said, leaning back slightly, you've done more than most trained soldiers would. His words settled over her like warmth, lingering long after he closed his eyes again to rest. The next few days brought change. With the general now conscious, Clara's duties shifted. She fed him more solid food, helped him sit upright longer each day, and read him the few newspapers that arrived from nearby towns. He asked questions about the state of the army, of Boston, of troop movements, many of which she didn't know how to answer. But when he asked about her, she was caught off guard. Why'd you go into the woods that night? He asked one afternoon, voice stronger now. She hesitated. I overheard something. Two loyalists. They said a general had been ambushed. I didn't know if it was true, but something in me said it was. He studied her. That something in you, was it courage or instinct? Clara thought about it. I think it was anger. That no one ever expects girls to do anything. That we're supposed to stay quiet, stay clean, stay safe. But none of us are safe. Not really. And I couldn't sit still anymore. The general didn't answer immediately. Then he nodded slowly. That's the kind of anger that wins wars. By the second week of his recovery, Clara noticed a shift in the way the soldiers at the church treated her. The guard stationed outside now nodded to her respectfully when she passed. The local physician had started asking her what doses of herbs she was using. Even William had gone quiet. His usual scolding replaced with awkward silence whenever they crossed paths. But not all reactions were warm. Some villagers whispered that Clara had gotten too comfortable around the general. That a girl her age, alone with a man of power, could easily be corrupted. Others suggested she was making up the story of how she found him. Fame-hungry, trying to marry into importance. Clara heard them all. But she didn't flinch. She had no interest in glory. And the general had treated her with nothing but dignity. Every time they spoke, she felt like she mattered. Not because of beauty or wealth, but because her mind and heart were finally seen. One evening, as the general practiced walking again, his arm draped over her shoulders, he looked out the church window and frowned. Something's wrong. Clara followed his gaze. What do you mean? The air. The quiet. Too quiet. Too still. A day later, their fear became reality. A rider arrived from a nearby town, breathless and pale. British troops had been seen just 10 miles west. Scouts suggested they were searching for someone high-ranking, possibly wounded. They've tracked me, the general said, rising from the cot despite his limp. Clara stepped forward. You're still healing. I won't let this town suffer because of me. She reached out. Then let me help. He paused. You've done enough, Clara. No, she said, her voice firm. I haven't. They worked through the night. Using maps the general had requested, Clara helped identify possible escape routes. Trails too narrow for horses, caves hidden behind pine ridges, river paths only locals knew. She helped coordinate messages to the town's sympathizers, sending children with coded notes to safe houses and allies. The general, despite the pain in his leg, prepared his uniform, sharpened a knife, and tucked a pistol into his belt. Clara, he said before he left, I owe you more than my life. I owe you my mission. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. If they catch you, they won't. And if they do, what then? He met her gaze. Then I'll die a free man. But not before I make sure you live free too. Her throat tightened. She reached into her satchel and pressed something into his hand. A small, dark root wrapped in cloth. Crush it and breathe it in if you're wounded again, she whispered. It dulls pain. But only for an hour. He looked at her for a long moment. You really were never too weak for war, Clara. They just didn't know what kind of war you were built for. Before the sun rose, General Elias Thatcher slipped into the forest with 2 scouts and vanished into the trees. And Clara, just a girl in a town at war, stood at the church door, heart pounding, ready for what came next. 2 days after the general vanished into the woods, the British arrived. Not a battalion, but enough to make the village of New Haven freeze in place. 30 redcoats, mounted and armed, marched into town as if they owned it. Their captain was a young, smug officer with polished boots and a sneer that didn't quite match the mud clinging to his coat. He ordered the villagers to gather in the square. Rifles pointed toward homes. Mothers clutched their children. Old men clenched their jaws and braced for what they'd seen before in other towns. Searches, interrogations, sometimes worse. Clara stood among the crowd, hidden beneath her cloak, her eyes fixed on the officer's face. I am Captain Graham Wilton, the man announced, his voice cold. We have reason to believe a high-ranking traitor to the crown passed through this area. Possibly wounded. Possibly aided. We will be searching every home and building. There were no cheers. Only silence. The townspeople glanced at each other, but no one moved. Wilton dismounted and stepped forward. If you're hiding someone, know this. The penalty for aiding a rebel general is death. Not exile. Not prison. Death. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She saw the fear ripple through the villagers, but she also saw something else. A flicker of resistance in the blacksmith's eyes. A tightening of her brother William's fists. The British began searching. They raided the church first. Clara watched from the edge of the crowd as soldiers ripped up floorboards, overturned cots, dumped out satchels of dried herbs and linens. But the general was long gone, and Clara had removed every trace of his presence the moment he left. One soldier, holding her crushed herbs in his hand, laughed. "Looks like a healer's bag," he said. "Unless she's mixing poison." Clara stepped forward. "It was mine," she said clearly. The crowd turned. Her brother's eyes widened. But Clara didn't blink. "I treat fevers, wounds, infections. I don't hide rebels." Wilton eyed her carefully. "A little girl with bandages and leaves." "I'm not little," she said. "And if your men keep stomping through the snow, they'll catch frostbite before you find anything useful." That earned a few surprised chuckles from the villagers, but Wilton didn't smile. He stepped closer to her. "I think you know something," he said low, eyes narrowed. "Something you're not telling." Clara held his gaze. Her heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. "I know that your breath smells like brandy and cowardice." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Wilton's hand snapped toward his holster. But before he could draw, a musket fired in the distance. Everyone turned toward the sound. Then another shot. And another. Not from within the town, but from beyond the ridge. The forest. The redcoats spun on their heels, forming lines, shouting orders. A soldier ran up, panting. "Sir. Diversion. Scouts report rebel forces approaching from the west." Wilton's face twisted. "Fall back. Form up. Move now." Within minutes, the redcoats had pulled out of New Haven in a rush of noise and panic, heading west to meet a fight they didn't expect. The moment they were gone, the town exhaled. People embraced. Children cried. Clara stood still, barely breathing. 'Cause she knew. It was him. That night, the stars came out clear and sharp, and Clara stood alone near the trailhead where she had once found the general, staring into the forest. The snow had begun to melt. The air smelled like pine and smoke. In the distance, far beyond where the trees turned black, faint booms echoed. Gunfire. And then silence. Just as she turned to go back, a figure emerged from the darkness. She froze. It was him. General Elias Thatcher limped toward her, supported by a scout, blood smeared across his sleeve, but alive. Very much alive. She ran to him. "You came back," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "You were right. The British came here. They would have killed innocents to find me. I couldn't let that happen. You didn't have to risk. I wanted to." He looked at her, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes, those clear blue eyes, were filled with pride. "I left something behind," he said quietly. Clara tilted her head. "What?" He smiled. "A promise." The next morning, the general officially revealed himself to the village, flanked by 2 rebel officers. He addressed the townspeople in the square, not as a wounded man, but as a commander once again. "I owe this village my life," he said. "But more than that, I owe it to one of your own. Someone who was told she was too weak, too quiet, too small. Someone who showed more strength than any man I've ever served with." Then, in front of the entire town, he turned to Clara and said, "Clara Whitmore, I am recommending you personally to General Washington for commendation. Not as a healer, not as a helper, but as a patriot, a heroine of this revolution." The village erupted in applause. Even William, eyes glassy, clapped with shaking hands. Clara stood still for a moment, stunned. Then she did something she'd never done before. She stepped forward and took the general's hand. "I didn't do this for medals," she said. I know, he replied. That's why you deserve them. Weeks passed. General Thatcher returned to active duty, leading troops north. But before he left, he gave Clara a leather-bound book. His field journal, with her name written on the first page. Write your story, he said. Let them know what war really looks like. She did. Clara Whitmore became a local legend. Young women began training as nurses and messengers. Children played games where they pretended to drag generals through the snow. But Clara remained humble. She returned to her cottage, brewed her herbs, walked the trails, waited for letters that arrived on horseback with the general's initials and careful handwriting. And every winter, when the snow came again, people would whisper. She was too weak for war. Until she saved a Patriot general with nothing but a blanket. And her courage,